So before we start today's video, I just want to quickly mention something about this particular series about playing around every single headliner and how we're not going to cover two specific verticals. If you do not care, I'll put a timestamp right here, somewhere around here, and feel free to just go straight into the video and look at all the Hyperpop and Jazz units to play around. But for those of you who care, there are two verticals that we will not be discussing for this series. One is the true damage vertical, and the second is the heartsteel. The reason why is because one, for true damage, there aren't a lot of compositions to talk about. The video itself would be pretty short, and there's not a lot of comps that are different that we haven't covered already. The only different ones are the Twin Terror Senna board and Reroll Yasuo. We've already covered the Akali board. It's actually just Karthus Akali. We've covered that in the Pentakill video. So there's not much to really talk about. It's just a lot of redundant content. There is like how to play around Qiyana, but Qiyana is still one of those units that I myself am still struggling to really understand how the most optimal way of playing around her is. And she's also kind of one of those units that I don't really see value in playing around versus playing something around like a Yorick. So again, maybe my opinion will change in the future, but as of right now, at the time of recording this, and especially before the set comes out to the live servers, I don't see much of a reason to cover the true damage one. The second vertical that might come as a shock is the heartsteel vertical, and the reason why I don't want to talk about that is because there aren't very many comments that rely on heartsteel headliners specifically. The only one is Yone reroll, but even then it's like you could play Riven reroll and still play Yone. And then the second one is just Ezreal big shot, but Ezreal big shot you can just flex around whatever. It's just two big shot. That's the only thing that matters. So they would be very quick videos, and it wouldn't really make sense to be like, oh, how to play around every single headliner within this vertical, because for the majority of that vertical, it does not really matter. Heartsteel is also one of those traits that you definitely want to play around the trait and focus way heavier around that rather than how to play around specific carry within the trait. So that's also the reason why I don't really want to cover it. But in the future, we will definitely be making a how to play Heartsteel video once I personally get a bit more of a grasp on the trait itself, because I don't think we've learned everything there is to know just yet based off what I've seen from pro players play and based off my own personal experience. But without further ado, let's get on to today's video and talk about Hyperroll and Jazz. Now, obviously, I have put both of these into the same video, and the reason why is because both of these traits are very, very small in terms of the vertical. First off, with Hyperpop, Lulu and Ziggs are the only two units that we have within this vertical. Very, very simple. For those of you who don't know what Hyperpop does real quick, Hyperpop, when the Hyperpop champion uses an ability, they grant mana and 4 seconds of attack speed to their two closest allies. As you go further up within this vertical, you get more mana and more attack speed buffs. It's a very, very simple, very, very straightforward vertical, and it's very easy to splash it to almost any single comp. But now let's hop into the first headliner of this vertical, which is going to be Lulu with +2 spellweaver. I do prefer +2 spellweaver over +2 Hyperpop for Lulu specifically if she's going to be your main DPS carry, and that is just because +2 spellweaver just makes 5 really easy to hit. You get to play the Lulu here with +2, Echo with +1, so you already have the 3 spellweaver completed with that. You don't even need to play the +2, but it's so easy to play the extra +2. Reason being is because if you're playing Echo, you're probably playing Blitzcrank, that is your main sentinel, and if you're playing Blitzcrank, you probably want Gragas in there for the disco, opens up bruisers, and then you get to get the Twisted Fate for 3 disco. It's very, very simple. Sona is in here as well with recently. You are now playing Sona with the extra attack speed buff instead of the healing buff. Reason being is that because the healing and shielding rather got nerfed pretty heavily. So you are definitely wanting to play around a different one instead. And I still think damage Sona is kind of not that great. Lulu, in terms of itemization, blue buff Archangels, this is a very strong way to itemize her. You can have a +1 with whatever. Does not really matter. I will say this though, Lulu 3 used to be very strong, and now at least with the current build that we have in the PvE, she is not as strong. She got gutted pretty hard, so I don't really see Lulu 3 being played that often, but still a very viable carry if you find yourself with a lot of natural Lulus and you can potentially play into this board. I will say this though, with Lulu headliner, she's actually way more viable as, in my opinion, a tempo carry. The way that I mean that is that if you hit a Lulu 3 early, I say just take it, especially if you're playing around AP components, and you just slam it during stage 3 and she is super good. She is super solid throughout the mid game, and she can very easily tempo you into an Ari board or a TF board, whatever you find. But nonetheless, I think Headliner Lulu is way better as a tempo unit rather than as a potential carry. So keep that in mind. Again, if Lulu 3 gets buffed in the future though, it will be a game changer. But now let's talk about Ziggs, who is the second unit within the Hyperpop vertical with the +2 dazzler. Now, if this looks any bit familiar to you, this is basically the same as Blitzcrank if you watch the Disco video, where he's incredibly self-sufficient, incredibly easy to just play onto any board, and if you have the headliner, you are automatically getting the +2 Ziggs. or sorry, plus 2-star ziggs. Ziggs is, in my opinion, the strongest AP carry of the set for obvious reasons. I mean, you can make the argument maybe Sona is better, but I just don't think she is. But Ziggs is just incredibly self-sufficient, has innate shred, and just deals a bunch of AoE damage. He's easily the premier 5-cost AP carry within the current set. And again, with plus 2 dazzler, very self-sufficient. You can flex whatever you want on the board. But then this brings us over to Ziggs with plus 2 Hyperpop, where the only difference is that you just add a Bard. You just get the dazzler bonus, and it's very, very easy. Obviously, we see that we are 1 out of 2 Jads, and one of the best endgame boards you can end on is Ziggs and Lucian dual carry. Now, I know some people might ask, well, okay, hey, look, you have the Sen on the board here, right? For the 2 rapid fire, which is cool, but why not just play Caitlyn, right? You could play Caitlyn here and Garen here. Totally makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you. But the thing that I would argue is that when you're playing Caitlyn and Garen here in the front and back, at this point, this Caitlyn isn't going to really be doing much because you're playing around Lucian and Ziggs rather than the Caitlyn at all. So if anything, I think it's actually better to play the Senna instead and you play around the Echo, because Echo 2 is just going to be a lot more tankier than a Garen 2. This can obviously change as the meta progresses. Maybe Caitlyn becomes a very, very strong unit, but in my opinion, at least with the current PBE build, this is the way to go. Again, especially because you're trying to cap out around Lucian 2 and trying to take in as many traits as you can, because we are playing into Jazz. Again, very, very strong board. Obviously, Blitzcrank is the main tank. Lucian is our main AD carry. But that basically covers Hyperpop. Very, very simple, very, very easy. Let's move on to Jazz, because speaking of Jazz, Lucian, Misfortune, Bard are the 3 units within this vertical. For those of you who don't know, Jazz just basically rewards you for playing horizontally, aka as many traits as possible. For each active trait, except uniques, your team gains bonus health and deals bonus damage. Now keep in mind, except uniques. There are sometimes where I see people, including myself, I made this mistake before, where you might be like, oh, I want to play Alawi if I'm ever playing Jazz because that gives me ill beats and that gives me extra percentage. It doesn't, because that's a unique trait. Ill beats is a unique trait. Things like Breakout for Akali, unique trait. So just keep that in mind when you're playing Jazz and you're like, hey, is this bugged? No, it's except uniques, okay? So you are getting slightly less percentage HP / damage than you'd expect, but I mean, that's just how the game is made. But now let's move on to our first headliner of the Jazz vertical, which is going to be around Bard plus 2 Jazz. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. This board is dog shit. It's really, really weak in the current PBE build, especially now that more people have gotten more used to the set. But if you want to have fun, this is a pretty good board. In terms of fun factor, it's great, but in terms of like actual strength, it's pretty weak. You're playing around Gragas 3, Bard 3, ideally for your main tank and your backline carry. Bard itemization being Ginsu, Shojin, Archangels. Now, is this the best absolute BIS for Bard? I actually don't know for certain. The reason is because, one, again, Bard carry is not very good, at least within the current build from what I've seen, but also because people haven't been experimenting too much because, again, the board is so weak. The idea is, though, is that you want the Bard to be casting as much as possible, and whenever you do have Bard on your board, the fights tend to last for a pretty long time. His headliner effect, by the way, the finale of Bard's first cast, each combat spreads an additional dude for every 8 times he's cast this game, and those dudes will deal bonus magic damage. So basically, you want this Bard to cast as much as possible, but you do need some level AP scaling, so that's where the Archangels is kicking in. Now again, is this the best BIS? I don't know for certain, but this is definitely a board that you could potentially maybe try out in the current set. Yes, I almost said patch, but I mean, it's not going to change. But if you try this patch, I mean, don't expect it to do great things. It's pretty weak from what I've seen. I think it needs like a minor buff. It's not that big, but it needs a minor buff somewhere. But nonetheless, fun board, but I don't think it's that strong. But moving on to our next unit, which is going to be Misfortune with plus 2 Jazz. I will say that for a 3-star 3 cost, she is very strong. She has consistently performed well within our in-houses with a bunch of challenger level players. And she's just a force to be reckoned with. Super fucking strong, even natural with a lot of Misfortunes. It's definitely a line you could consider. We do have the 3-star set here as well. The only reason this is here is just because I do personally believe that 3-star set is like the strongest 3-cost tank that you can get. Obviously, Amumu and Mordekaiser are, you know, units that could compete for this title, but I do think, at least from what I've seen, that especially with 4 bruisers 3-star set, thing is an absolute menace. Now, Misfortune itemization real quick, it is IE Last Whisper, but +1 can be whatever. For her headliner effect, she only gains plus 25% attack speed. It's not really much to, oh sorry, plus 25% AD, not very much to be talking about. But what I will say though is that she does also get bonus attack speed based off her ability if any of the units that she autos does die. 40% is quite a bit. So she's basically ramping up mana anyways. I don't really think Shojin is necessary. It is an option, but I think 3 damage items is totally okay. I will say though, Bebe does have a pretty interesting build idea on her, which is going to be the Ginsu IE Last Whisper. I'm not 100% sure if I'm sold on the Ginsu Misfortune, but because of the way that her ability works, I can see the vision. I can see that being the case. Definitely a very cool board to consider, and definitely something to play around if it's ever given to you. I will say this is just an example board that you could consider, you know, capping out with. It's, again, if you do end up playing around the set, it's very, very easy to play around Heartsteel as well. You just play Ezreal for the extra +2 for the big shot, and then that gives you 2 out of 3 Heartsteel, so you just play Aphelios. And if you're playing Aphelios, then you can just play a secondary carry like Lucian for your secondary AD carry. Totally makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we are flexing our front line here. Echo Blitzcrank is just, Echo Blitzcrank is going to be our sort of +2 for our front line, but you can do whatever feels good, whatever you find. You don't have to play something like this, especially if it's at 3, like I had mentioned before. 4 Bruiser is super, super fucking strong. So you could even just play something like this, and this is totally acceptable. Makes a lot of sense. Definitely a very strong board to consider. Obviously, Misfortune has 2 traits, not just Jazz, so you could have the option to play +2 Big Shot. But if you do play +2 Big Shot, the only difference between the cores, or rather the clusters of these compositions, is that you are probably going to play around 4 Big Shot instead, because it's just so damn easy to tech into. You absolutely don't need to, but it's like, it's there. It's just there. You might as well just pick it up, right? There are other variations that you can play as well, where instead of playing something like this, if you do end up playing around something like 4 Bruiser, you could potentially do something along the lines of maybe playing around Spellweaver for your secondary carry, units like Lulu and Ari, and then this is totally fine as well. Obviously, if you're going to play something like this, Jazz is always welcome, and you can just do something like that. Totally makes a lot of sense. Very, very strong board to consider if you are playing around this line. Moving on finally onto our last Jazz rapid fire carry, premier carry of the set, it's going to be Lucian. Lucian with +2 rapid fire. Now, I do like Lucian with +2 rapid fire better than +2 Jazz, and the only reason is because I do think the +2 rapid fire makes Lucian very self-sufficient. And so because he's so self-sufficient, but he is 1 out of 2 Jazz, you just play the Bard, but that opens up Ziggs for, like we had mentioned before, Ziggs, Lucian, dual carry. Very, very strong board to be playing around. Flex whatever the fuck you want in the front line. Lucian itemizations, I do think Deathblade, i.e. Guardbreaker, is best, but there are a bunch of different ways. You can just play basically any 80 item and it totally makes sense. Red buff is actually okay as well on him. GS is fine. Last Whisper is fine. You have a bunch of different options that are available to you when playing around Lucian with the +2 rapid fire. Again, this is just a very example board. It can be whatever you want, but like I said before, Lucian and Ziggs is more than enough for your backline damage. You just flex whatever the fuck you want for your front line. Blitzcrank, Thresh, Mordekaiser, Yorick, Alawi, Zac. Does not matter, but you do want to try to play as many traits as you can, because again, we are playing around Jazz +2 for that extra sweet bonus damage. But now obviously this lastly brings up Lucian with +2 Jazz, which I think is the lower cap in my opinion. The only reason I do say that is because it does force you to play a rapid fire unit onto your board, so it kind of forces you to play the Garen. The idea being is that Garen is a Sentinel, gives justification for the Blitzcrank here, but also you do want to play again horizontally for the Jazz, and Caitlyn is just like kind of a trait bot in this scenario. Again, you are playing around the 2-star Lucian, so your Caitlyn items, if you were carrying her until this point, are certainly going to go onto the Lucian. And now your Caitlyn just doesn't have any items, and she's just a trait bot for 8-bit and rapid fire, both of which are not doing anything on your board. Obviously, we do have the Ziggs as well, who's going to be our secondary carry ideally, but maybe if you find yourself with a lot of 80 items for some reason, then this could potentially be a endgame board that you could play around. Again, very, very strong board, and again, this is just an example board that you can play around, but just play around whatever you find, whatever you hit. Just try to play horizontally for that extra bonus percentage damage when you're playing around Jazz. One last thing to note is that Lucian's headliner effect, he actually does 5% more AD, but also his Arpeggio fires 3 more shots, Arpeggio being his ability. So it's actually quite a strong headliner effect compared to other headliners that we've seen in the past, but he's a 5 cost. I mean, it's kind of expected, you know what I mean? But anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this video. I apologize if it seems like I rushed things a little bit, but there isn't too much to talk about. Again, the set is very, very flexible. These videos are only meant to give you a glimpse or an idea as to how to play around these units if you ever come across them. But again, at the end of the day, set 10 is an incredibly flexible set. Play what you hit and play what you find. But until then, I'll see you guys all later for the next video, and take care, guys, and happy climbing.